This is a bit like friends, Romans, countrymen. Nice to see so many, not old faces, so many familiar faces. It's good. It's good. It's funny doing these things. You get this slice through society, then you have another talk somewhere else, and it's another little slice, but it is a little place, and we get lots of overlap, and that's great. Now, I'm here to launch a small but important book written by a rather large but no less important man. But Don's as modest as he is large, and by large he's big. He's a bit of a bear. And it's a very important book because numbers of reasons. It's one of the more authentic books I've read. I've read lots of tirades about this sort of thing, and Tas Times is full of short, nutty pieces on this sort of issue. But this is a very clever book, about 45,000 words, little book. Looks like Don published it himself. Yeah. So no photos, which is understandable with that circumstance. But it's very important because I think it only came about because Don's somewhat of a visitor. He's a very recent Tasmanian relatively, and he brings this wealth of experience from parts of the world, particularly Africa, but he's travelled well beyond that, as you know. And if you've read this, you'll know it very well. But Don being a good journalist, a very good journalist, seems to have a way of plucking not just low-hanging fruit, but all sorts of fruit around the place to make a story. Methods of presentation. There's some very clever ideas. I had a smart-ass concept at a conference years ago about starting up glass-bottom bus roadkill tours. And that was just a throwaway line. I was being cynical about attitudes to roadkill and whatever. But Don thought about that, picked it up somewhere along the line, thought about it and turned it into a theme in part for this book. He does digress occasionally, but it's always to add to the whole story and bring you home again to the main theme, which is really good. Now, this roadkill issue, I do know a lot about dead animals too, because essentially dead ones are departed live ones. So if you want to know your live ones, you've got to know about dead animals and what's causing them to die. This has been a weeping sore since really about the 70s, late 60s, 70s, when two things happened, two packages of things happened. One was wallaby population started to go through the roof with the beginnings of modern pasture, irrigation, stuff like that, diminishment of snaring, 1080 poison was reduced in concentration, so it wasn't quite so effective, not so brutal, let's say. And so you had and with the wallabies came more devils were starting to creep up. So you had, in some places, for some species, more wildlife, but you also had at the same time lots more cars. Everywhere was using bitumen like mad, so roads were being sealed. New roads are still going in all over the place in the 70s. So that's when roadkill really started to take notice, and I've got some very old collections of letters to the editor and articles in papers, and that's the first time, really the 70s, that we started to see this issue come up. And of course, much to the amusement of too many Tasmanians. Now, I often wonder why it takes someone like Don, a relative newcomer, to drag us old horses to drink. I think long-term Tasmanians, hopefully not myself, I don't think so, because I still get appalled. I'm used to it. They've inured to it somewhat. Their skin's a bit thick. And of course, most Tasmanians are in complete denial. It's easy to grab a positive spin, and people grab it. But reading this, Riding the Devil's Highway, you really realise that our denial as a community is an excuse for bad behaviour. It's as simple as that. And the bad behaviour is essentially careless driving, and it's not much more than that. This all boils down to a very small amount of resin. Now, something I really like in here, and it's been teasing my mind about how to tackle this sort of thing, and of course Don just goes and does it, being a confident journalist, is he shreds some myths. And one of the myth is that the amount of roadkill simply reflects the amount of wildlife. Well, it doesn't. Where you get to a point where you have lots and lots of traffic and lots of fast roads, with some species, they are very prone to get road-killed. So you can almost eliminate some species with road-killed, even if they're quite rare. This is well known around the world. For instance, animals as diverse as badgers, proper badgers, not wombats, in the UK, you get half of their mortality is simply roadkill. The biggest threatening process for the Florida panther, this bloody great cat, is roadkill. That's what'll knock them off, if anything does in the end. And where you don't have roadkill, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not wildlife. You might just have careful drivers, or not many drivers, or more tourists, because tourists are far less of a hazard than locals who couldn't care less, because they're kind of inured to it. So I firmly reject or challenge the throwaway line that it just means there's lots of wildlife. Well, it does for a little while, but the end point is not so cheery. There's and since the Tasmanian devil's a topic here, it's topical, it's fashionable. I'm not sure fundamental attitudes to devils have changed that much. People who appreciate devils now were probably at worst ambivalent before. Most people who are ambivalent now were probably very negative before about devils. So that's an aside. Another story. We consider the risks to devils. You've got, picture Tasmania, picture your road network. Now, it's a given that any devil that has part of a fast road in its home range is at risk, some degree of risk. And a devil's home range is usually about 4 kilometres apart, across. So what that means is any devil that lives within 4 kilometres of a fast road is somewhat at risk. Now, I did a GIS thingy on a map of Tasmania, and if you add a buffer of 4 kilometres along the side of each road, that occupies a third of Tasmania. A third. So what it means is, even now, what some parties would claim is a very undeveloped state, and some of us would claim is already overdeveloped, but even now, you can argue there's a third of Tasmanian devils at risk of roadkill, even with all that apparent space in between roads, because these big animals move around. Now, what that boils down to is not all those animals get killed, of course, but it does boil down to something like 5 or 6% of Tasmanian devils get killed a year on the road. And that's with or without disease. It's irrelevant. The disease is irrelevant to that. The absolute numbers, it's relevant, but not the proportion, okay? So it is a conservation issue, and challenge people who glibly dismiss it. I encourage you to. And Don's comprehensively challenged that through a number of ways. One very important way is Don's very professional use of the best data, and he's happy to use anecdotes, personal communications, whatever, stories, but he also uses the best data, and there's some very good data out there to show this sort of impact. At the times in the past, I've tried to think, there's all this roadkill, hundreds of thousands. I suspect much closer to 1 million vertebrates a year than 500,000. And I've thought about this for decades. And I used to think, well, maybe those couple 100,000 wallabies and possums and that, really, that's all thylacines used to eat. So it doesn't make much difference. That's now we've lost thylacines, cars are doing the same thing, but they don't, of course, because the sort of animal a car will kill is completely different to a predator will kill, because so the selection pressure is completely different. A car often kills perfectly healthy, fit, big adult animals, whereas predators often focus on the sick, the slow, the injured or whatever. And the species list is completely different, because the windscreen is completely different to a set of teeth. Stuff like that. So you can counter all these arguments people will throw up, and Don sort of rattled through these arguments very well, and if I'd written that book it would have been hard to understand. Don's written it, and it's really easy to go along for the ride. It's a smooth conversation. Animal welfare is something Don brings up, and it's muttered about in letters to the editor. I've written about it a couple of times with wildlife, but it's possibly one of the more important ethical issues. The numbers killed through conservation, generally at this stage in Tasmania's development, you can just cope with. But the animal welfare issue is a really interesting one, and I'm really pleased that Don gave it lots of pages. And he's not necessarily calling it animal welfare, he's just talking about how confronting the grim realities of this, the bloody carpet, I think was one term. a lot of these animals aren't killed quickly. So roadkill, you might even say, it's like road collision. Roadkill is a catchy word, but it doesn't actually describe it. I've run over a lot of things in my millions of kilometres I've driven over the years. I usually try and find that animal as much for the welfare issue as to find out what happened. And I can't find about half the animals I've hit hard enough, and it's only 1 or 2 a year, hit hard enough, here am I saying only, yeah, hit hard enough that I think they would probably be incapacitated in some way. So if you go along a road and just count dead things, you could easily be only counting half of what's actually out there. Birds bounce off, and a wombat hobbles off, and you'll never find it, that sort of thing. I've walked roads to find stuff in ditches and that, and often you have to drive or walk a place about 3 times before you get a thing. So that's why I say the toll can actually be even higher than we're talking about. This animal welfare issue, people say, oh, you shouldn't stop on roads and help an injured animal, it's too dangerous or whatever. Well, that's a personal judgment, that's up to common sense. You can do that safely if you want to. Don confronts something that is kind of, most people don't want to talk about, and that's the deliberate running over of wildlife. I've seen many examples of that. I remember driving down to Dun Alley, it's not a funny story, seeing a driver coming the other way, and he actually swerved off the road well into the nature strip to run over an echidna and come back on, and he's going like this as he drives past me. Stuff like that. Watching guys weaving all over the road trying to hit wallabies as they go home to Lilydale. It just goes on and on. So that's one element, is this malicious element, but that produces injuries, so it is technically an act of cruelty because most people aren't stopping. And one of the worrying things for me is, amongst this demoralising aspect of all these dead animals, is people, it's well known that people, particularly young people, who demonstrate cruelty to animals go on to become violent adults towards people. So this careless, let alone the malicious attitude, this who cares about animal suffering is not a trivial issue. It's not just an annoying dinner party issue. It's actually part of what should make us a humane society. So there's reasons to worry about those sorts of actions, which are violent. And no good can come of that sort of careless attitude to life, whatever life it is. Don also picks up on a really good point. He talks about these sorts of issues, the animal welfare issues, the ethics of it, the demoralising aspect of going for a drive in Tasmania sometimes. But it's so frustrating, and as Don points out, because the reasons are well known, they're proven if you believe that excellent data from Hobart and friends. And it's completely in the face of there's nothing you can do attitude, which I saw letters, posts on Tas Times about that. Oh, you can't do anything. So it's actually good news because it means there's lots of wildlife. And that really worries me, because we know what to do. It's a small change in human behaviour, and we seem, as a species almost, condemned to sort of rush somewhere to wait. And I know people who say there's nothing you can do about wildlife. The animals are going to die. You'll hit them anyway, whatever you try and do. And I thought hard about those people that have rattled those things off to me, and those people invariably drive fast and rush. And they get somewhere and then slob about, instead of just taking that extra couple of minutes to get there and not hit anything. And it applies in the day and night, echidnas, snakes, birds, all that stuff in the day. It's not just drive slowly at night, although that's a very useful badge to make a start on. So I think that tackling this roadkill issue is one of the last great attitudinal hurdles in Tasmania, quite frankly. And it is a big hurdle because it involves an attitude to life in general, not just animals. And Don has taken a step that people like myself should have taken a long time ago, really. But Don has the literal stature and the correspondence skills to make that happen, and it's fantastic. But things change, as my gorgeous wife Kate reminded me. Things change, and she reminded me about the changes I've seen. These vicious, attitudes to devils of only a decade or two ago. People just killing them willy-nilly. I know farmers who've won land care awards and all this who would run over every devil they could, kill anything like that. One guy rang me up to have a whinge about when they put guideposts in along back Tea Tree Road, because then he couldn't hit the possums because he might lose a headlight. This sort of stuff. And Don rattles off anecdotes like that through there. I'm not going to repeat them, but there's you can change that. The attitudes to devils have changed. Aren't devils lucky this is an ugly cancer? If it wasn't, no one would take any notice. So there's these weird elements of luck sliced through our problems, and often it works to our benefit. Attitudes to eagles, you know, most eagles that have a problem now have hit something of more or less their own accord. They haven't been shot. And it's a fantastic change. Snakes and sharks. Snakes are protected, lots of sharks are protected. There's a big fight over what happens. There's no automatic, let's go and kill the sharks if someone gets chewed up. Attitudes to overfishing. Things change for the better often, and often they're small accruements that are in parallel, and I'm aware of a lot of these issues. I'm interested in fisheries, so I'm aware of those parallel issues, and they add up to a lot, whereas we often get a bit alarmed when we have major losses. I think the accumulation can sometimes be a net, get us ahead, be a net positive, which is really good. So maybe we're not so stupid. But the stupid thing is not acting on the best information we have, and I think there's something in ornithology that we might winkle out here, and there's a lot about driving fast that smacks of showing off, and a lot of showing off is about sexual advertising, and it's well documented in birds, and I reckon if you chase down that literature, John, you might find out there's a very deep-seated thing in people about driving fast, being the fastest, showing off and all the rest, even if it has no rollout in reality. We may be dealing with a really hard thing to beat, because people won't even slow down to save their own lives. So then people of course think, well, let's have an engineering solution. And there are some very clever technologies now where a car passes a certain point, coming up to say a roadkill hotspot, black spot, you know, James Bond beam sends a message ahead to a beeper that beeps a mile ahead, gets animals off the road or whatever it does before that car even gets there. Engineering solutions are one thing, but it doesn't solve the attitudinal problems. I think solving the roadkill issue gives us a fantastic opportunity. Anyway, in thanking Don for using his experience and undoubted talents in tackling this rather odious but I think resolvable and perhaps will come out ahead subject. He did it with great sensitivity. There's jokes in there, but they're not at the expense of the animals. There's respect, there's great integrity, which I've, over some years with Don, I've learnt that's one of his great assets. It's a great pleasure to launch this book. So, buy them up and make Don proud.